From Burleson to Venus and Grandview to Godley, this is the voice of Johnson County, JOCO Community Radio.
Hey travelers, do you want to save money on your next flight? Then pick up the phone and call. That's right, call, because the best prices are not online. They're with SmartFares. See, SmartFares has special deals with the airlines. When they have unsold seats, they use SmartFares to fill them. So you get airline tickets at ridiculously low prices. Our prices are too low to publish online. With the extra money you'll save, you can book another trip or treat yourself to dinner or shopping. So stop searching all of those travel sites to find the lowest price on your next flight. Let one of our SmartFares expert travel agents find ridiculously low prices for you. Call SmartFares today and get the best price on your next flight. Guaranteed. Also, save up to 50% off business and first class tickets.
855-325-1820. 855-325-1820. That's 855-325-1820.
Have you ever met a single person in your life that enjoys paying taxes? No, no one does. If you can't sleep at night because you have a huge problem with the IRS, I've got some free advice for you. This service is strictly limited to individuals that owe the IRS $10,000 or more in back taxes. And if you qualify, we can guarantee that you won't be writing a big fat check to the IRS, or our services cost you nothing. The first 100 people that call today will get a free tax consultation worth $500. Stop worrying about your IRS problem. We can help you, we promise. Call the tax doctor right now. I mean right now, to learn more.
800-240-4587. 800-240-4587. 800-240-4587. That's 800-240-4587.
Fast Track Student Loans can get your student loans out of default, stop any wage garnishments, stop collection calls, and stop seizure of your tax refund. Give yourself a break. Stop the stress and get your student loan payments down to as little as $25 a month based on what you can afford to pay. 800-709-4395. 800-709-4395. 800-709-4395. 800-709-4395.
Why have thousands of aspiring authors teamed up with Christian Faith Publishing to publish their book? Because Christian Faith Publishing is an author-friendly publisher who understands that your labor is more than just a book. We provide authors freedom and flexibility throughout the publishing process, professional book editing, award-winning design, and some of the highest royalty structures in the publishing industry. And as always, you will retain 100% of the rights to your book.
I was looking to find a company that I could trust, one that assisted in the editing process completely.
The most important qualities that I was looking for was a publisher who was honest and upfront, no hidden costs or fees, and owning the rights to my own work.
Christian Faith Publishing will publish, market, and sell your books in all major bookstores, online booksellers, as well as specialty Christian bookstores. Call for your free author submission kit.
800-978-4812. 800-978-4812. 800-978-4812. That's 800-978-4812.
Fast Track Student Loans can get your student loans out of default, stop any wage garnishments, stop collection calls, and stop seizure of your tax refund. Give yourself a break. Stop the stress and get your student loan payments down to as little as $25 a month based on what you can afford to pay. 800-709-4395. 800-709-4395. 800-709-4395. 800-709-4395.
You're listening to JOCO Community Radio.
Well, good afternoon, Johnson County. Welcome back on this gorgeous, beautiful Thursday afternoon. We have some sun outside, a beautiful day that God has given us. We will be glad and rejoice in it. I want to thank you for tuning back in. If you're a repeat listener, if you're brand new to this show, you're in for a whopper today. And no, this isn't Burger King. This is a place where we actually discuss the concerns and comments of the common man. I'm here with my good friend and congressional candidate Matthew Lucci, Republican for TX25. I had seen him out in the lobby and decided to bring him in for a very big, loaded topic today. and that is federal expansion since the days of FDR. For those who are younger may not realize it, that was President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the longest serving president, almost 16 years in office, and spent his dying breath in that seat. And he was replaced by Harry Truman. For those who are curious, he was the one that started really vamping up the Manhattan Project, dropped 2 atomic bombs because apparently one didn't do enough damage. So what we're going to be discussing today is a little something that many of the greatest generation, the people of the boomers, didn't really discuss enough, that like they should have. And the people in the federal House, federal Congress, the Senate didn't really discuss enough of before this was passed. And that is, what ramifications have we seen from the New Deal? Now, I must divulge from this. This is not going to be a purely statistical based an expository explanation of the entirety of the New Deal, what came about of it, what good or bad it's done. We're going to be focusing on the cons of it today. What really stuck out today? What are the consequences that we are facing for the mass project that was, I want to say, this big monster that was let loose, a hydra, if you will, of all these new government agencies, all this government spending. And I know that many of you complain about not getting your Social Security checks, not getting the money, the entitlements that you get from the government. We're going to be discussing a loaded question. Is that really the goal of the federal government? And the second question, do we need most of these programs to continue? That's kind of going to be the theme for today. And like I said, I'd seen Mr. Lucci out in the hallway, and we decided to just bring him in and have him discuss it with us. He's running for Congress. I feel like as a candidate, and we would do the same thing for Roger Williams if Roger Williams ever walked in here, which is pretty far-fetched, I would say. You know, we've only had a few congressional candidates come in the door since this show has been started, and most of them stay, shake hands for about 5 minutes, kiss the baby, and run. But Mr. Lucci has stuck it out with us, so appreciate you being here, Matthew.
Yeah, of course, Jake. It's always great to be on Let Freedom Ring, or really any of the Joko community radio shows. In fact, I'll be on Greg Cooper's show after this one. That's why I was out there in the lobby preparing a few things for that show. And you just looked out the little window here from the studio, and everybody's like, hey,
there's
I know
a
you.
little window here. Anybody can see it. I don't know, but you can holler through that thing pretty good.
Yeah. For those of you who follow me on social media, I was filming one of the little reels, the little videos that I post on Facebook and Instagram and YouTube. And I think he overheard me and turned around and was like, hey, you, get in here.
Get in here, man.
It's like, you are someone who should definitely be talking about
I feel like
much
it's necessary, though, that we have a gentleman running for Congress to come in here and speak about federal expansion, because you hear a lot about this. You hear people say, I will cut the budget of the federal government in half or a quarter, or we will lose 10% of our spending over the next 25 years. Good luck, next generation. Like, that's going to happen. And the numerous times I've talked to Matthew, you know, we have had many indulgent conversations about what really needs to happen, what reforms need to be made for the future of the federal government, because the budget that we're running on is not sustainable.
And we're about to have another debt ceiling fight here in a couple of weeks.
Yeah.
I mean,
and it wasn't
days,
less than a year since we had the last one.
Well, it was about 30 days ago, because they passed a continuing resolution to keep the government open for another 45 days. A lot of that has been taken up with fighting for who the next speaker should be, and they can't pass any budget bills until they have a speaker in place. And so now we're down to the last, I think, roughly 3 weeks to figure out what we're going to do as a country to avoid a government shutdown. That is almost inevitably going to happen, because we've got people in Congress who care a lot more about themselves and their rich corporate donors in Washington, D.C., than they do about doing the business of the American people. And that's been the case for a long time. And so, as I said last time I was on this show, earlier this week, actually, that politics as usual is not working anymore. And that's clear as we have government shutdown after government shutdown after government shutdown on the horizon. And the thing is, every time we shut down the government, it actually ends up costing the American taxpayers more money than it would have if the already very bloated government was able to continue operating.
Yeah.
And I think it's very important that we go back to one of the big turning points in the size of the federal government and the scope of the federal government back during the FDR years, because in order for most of our listeners at home to really understand what's going on here,
Yeah.
prior to FDR, you basically only had one type of funding, and that was discretionary funding, which meant Congress every single term, every 2 years, you'd go up there to Washington, D.C., and you would come up for the budget for that year, and you'd have a pretty good idea of what you wanted the second year to be, and then you would just basically ratify it the second year. But it was discretionary, meaning they could choose every single year what that annual budget would look like, where that money was going.
Sort of a line item agenda.
Yeah, they were doing that back before the FDR years. FDR basically, with a lot of his government entitlement programs, many of which are still alive today, most of which are way bigger today than they were ever intended to be. We went down that path because he came up with this idea of mandatory spending, of something where Congress had to send money toward this. Congress had to send money
entitlement spending, essentially.
Exactly. Government programs, entitlement, expanded welfare,
Social Security Administration.
Exactly. So these are all things that are considered mandatory spending. So when you send your member of Congress up there, they really don't get a say on this unless they put together a bill to cut into it. Now, discretionary spending, you start at zero and you build your way up.
Yeah.
Mandatory spending, you have to spend this much money unless you put in a bill that cuts it down. So it's this opposite fiscal approach to the federal government and what their role is in the budgeting process. And then that has only gotten bigger and expanded upon with guys like LBJ.
The Great Society.
Exactly. With Barack Obama as well from 2008 to 2016. And now a lot of those entitlements are third rail issues where you do not want to touch that issue because it's just become so ingrained in our society of like, yes, Social Security is something that the federal government is responsible for. And even people who are very conservative are still very much in favor of Social Security, even though it is not a very fiscally conservative policy to get behind. And it's not a policy or program that really is sustainable in the long term. I mean, people my age, we've basically given up on the idea that we're ever going to get back what we are putting in. And that's a problem.
Yeah.
Social Security, as it is currently structured, is the world's largest Ponzi scheme. And so if we really want to be taking care of our seniors decades into the future, there has to be some reforms because at this point, even investing in the market would have drastically outpaced what our Social Security program did. And that's because of the way that FDR had originally structured it back in the 1930s.
Yeah. So we're going to get right into really the beginning here. And I'm looking at a graph right now from the Tax Policy Center. And essentially this graph goes from 1962 to about 2019. And, I'm sitting here trying to look through these graphs and find the one that I had found a while back. But on a scale of 0 to 100%, what we're looking at is discretionary spending in 1962 was roughly about 65% of our budget. So we're talking about, those things that Matthew discussed. Those would be things like what the federal government needs to operate, essentially. Department of Defense budget, Department of Education budget, Department of Health.
Heck, even infrastructure.
Yeah.
That's discretionary. That's not something the federal government has to fund every single year. That's why we have like one major infrastructure bill every 5 years on average.
And so we look at the mandatory spending, as you mentioned, Matthew, in 1962. It was roughly, I would say, 90 minus 65. We're talking about almost, roughly 30% of the federal budget was mandatory spending. Now, when we get to 2019 on the other side of this graph, our discretionary spending is only about 35%, and our mandatory spending has gone up about 55 to 60%. So 60% of our budget now is spent on Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and these entitlement programs. Now, I'm not going to jump into the question of is this the goal of the federal government to beginning, because that gets into the whole debate about what Chief Justice John Roberts, many might not remember, but he was the sole vote in the Supreme Court that kept Obamacare and the Affordable Care Act alive, but not because it was an entitlement program. He had argued it based on the power of Congress to operate under the Commerce Clause. The Congress has the ability to tax and spend. Therefore, it is Congress's ability to tax and spend for the Affordable Care Act that should keep it legitimate. Now, we're not here to debate the most intricate things of these plans, but when we look at the spending from FDR, when we look at the debt and the spending under it, FDR, if you look at the rise of per capita federal spending in 1945, this isn't even when we talk about all of these entitlements coming into question. We are sitting roughly at $9,000. And we have not seen that. We will never see that again until George Bush's second term begins, that we are spending over what FDR had. And it's not until Trump, I get into the discussion of Trump and the whole stimulus bills. Now, many might blame Trump. You will hear Joe Biden come out on the radio. You'll hear him come out on the news, and he will say, well, the last president spent $10 trillion more than he had. We're cutting that spending down. Well, of course, you're cutting it down because we don't need a stimulus anymore. And the second thing is, many might not realize this, but it was not Donald Trump's choice to spend that $10 trillion. You have to come at this from the politician's point of view. You have a majority, correct me if I'm wrong, we had a majority, at least one house of our legislature was majority Democrat. And so the Republicans, in turn, whichever house proposes the bill, they have to come up with an identical bill in the other house. So if the House wants a spending bill passed, the Senate has to come up with an ideal model of it in the Senate's terms.
And the House has the power of the purse. The House determines where the money goes. And so what we had was a Democratic House of Representatives during the second half of the Trump presidency. And so the best that Donald Trump could do was veto bills.
And even then, it's most of the Republican senators, most of the Republican House that would have had the key votes to override these big stimulus bills, these big, I think I had counted up $10.5 trillion at its peak was what was spent on stimulus. When we discuss the politician's point of view, now, given we're not sticking up for the ideals of these people, we're not sticking up for what they believe, we're not sticking up for who they are as a person or their career. But if you were in Congress and the public was being fed this propaganda day after day of wear your mask, get your vaccine so old people don't die, do all of these things that we might not even do under a constitutional republic, and frankly look more like Nazi Germany or the Soviet socialist republics, not something that you would see in the United States. But they have been feeding this collectivist approach for years during COVID. And when the stimulus bills finally came up, similar to FDR's New Deal, FDR or the House Democrats in this instance propose a big spending solution. They're like, we spend this, it will keep businesses afloat. You'll see people's health rise. You will see consumer spending go up. That's not what happened. What most people did was pocket the money or put it in a bank account. So that 60% of that money is probably still sitting around. That's why we're in the inflationary crisis that we are, is that money was never spent, and therefore the shrinking capacity of the Federal Reserve could never have been met. And so if you were Donald Trump and you had the 70% of the country, even Republicans, supporting this big stimulus bill because there's no way this money is going to come out from anywhere else. The public's not going to spend this money while they're sitting at home. Which we get into the success of these corporations like Amazon and all that, why they're cornering the marketplace, why we need new trust bills or whatever, all stemmed from the same spending spree. And I'm going to show you how these parallels come together with the New Deal. But Donald Trump is not going to veto that bill. Number one is because He understands that the majority of the country now has this collectivist mindset that we must take care of our elders, we must take care of our businesses. And he understands that if he doesn't do it and sends it back to the House, he's probably not going to be very favored. He's probably not going to get along with his Democrat colleagues that he's forced to get along with. Number two is he's relying on this as a reelection.
Mhm.
The president can always give the Federal Reserve another target, another interest target. The president can always cut this back in spending if he wants to.
But at
He
the
can
end of the
always-
day, it's the president that is who gets the blame when
Yeah.
the economy goes downhill.
So these House Democrats really played Trump into a sphere of you either pass this and look like a generous guy and look like you want to help millions of Americans, even if it's not something he wants to do, or Trump can face the music and look like a really bad dude and look like he doesn't give two craps about the elderly, that he doesn't give anything about small businesses. So really the propaganda of this was let's pin this on the president and get a Democrat president in next, which if anybody's seen what Joe Biden's done, Joe Biden has not done anything for this country, I would argue. And I really question anybody out there. And this isn't to come at you or to be regressive towards somebody out there, but the people that voted for him, I want you to listen in. Comment down in the section. We are all inclusive here. I have no formal ties. Matthew is running as a Republican, but he's the most centrist man I've ever met.
I'm very conservative, man.
Yeah, I mean, you come at something though from common sense, like
which leads me to be conservative.
Yeah, and this is a time when we need people that are willing to work together, but people that are not willing to withhold their own ideology or their own ethics from this. Government really needs our own ethics again, because when we do these big spending bills, and you see the Democrats do this, the Democrats have lost a lot of common sense, a lot of conservatism in their own party too. But name something in the comments if you want. Name one law that you remember Joe Biden passing. Name one law that Joe Biden has signed. Name one executive order. Name one thing that he spent money on aside from Ukraine. That is my challenge today. Aside from that, we're going to skip over to the next thing, and that is welfare spending. I know a lot of people don't want to talk about this. I personally am kind of in the middle. The federal government's job is not to ensure that I am entitled with health care. It's not the job of the federal government to ensure that I am entitled with everything that I could do right on my own. Because if they didn't tax my Social Security, I could invest that money however I want. I could have an extra $40, $50 at the end of the week in my paycheck. Or if you have a better job, you could have a lot more money that is not going to pay for these social programs that you're not using, that you're not going to use for 75 years. Now, I personally am for, if we are going to keep Social Security, which it looks like at this point we're going to have to because it's become so normalized, and I really want to hear Matthew's thought on this. I think it should be an opt-in, opt-out system. There should be an optional program that you don't have to opt into Social Security until a certain age. You should be able to invest that money. The government should give you an option to invest that money in the stocks and whatever is a stable, secure source for your money. And then when you're 75 and you want the government to ensure its fiduciary security, you should be able to invest that money in a federal bank, a federal share program, and be able to pull it out if you need it. There shouldn't be any way. It should be like privatized retirement. There should be no excuse that the government says, well, I know you paid in $5,000 a year for 50 years of your life, but we're only going to give you $100 a month. I hope that covers gas. So we look at the total welfare spending in 1950, and this is from the Heritage Foundation, given that they are conservative, so keep that in mind. But numbers really have no bias when you sit here and look at them. 1950, the total spending in trillions of dollars as of 2016. And so 1950, we're roughly looking at not even a tenth of $1 trillion. So we're looking at roughly about $50 to $75 billion on welfare spending in 1950. You get to 1981, the Reagan slashes in 1981. We were probably sitting at $400 billion, which that cut only lasted, not even a decade, because back all the way up into 2000, when we're talking about Bush getting in, early Bush election, we're now sitting at $600 billion. So in 20 years, the slashes only took off a year's worth of spending, and we're on our way back up $200 more billion. 2016, $1.12 trillion. Now, given welfare is not going to be as much as our Social Security is, but what we see is the government is taking more of an institutional role in privatized healthcare. We see that under the Affordable Care Act. We've seen that under what Trump really wanted to get done. Trump Care, I think, was something that was floating around in the ether during his presidency. We don't see a lot of good coming from this, though. We talk about these alphabet agencies. We talk about privatizing or publicizing healthcare with the federal government. We don't really see the benefits coming back in the amount that we spend.
Yeah, and in fact, what the Affordable Care Act or Obamacare really did was it took a lot of folks here in the United States and put them on the worst health care that they could possibly get in this country. And I'll explain why that is, and it's something that shocks a lot of people. Over the last 3 years, the 3 years leading up to COVID-19,
yeah,
the United States was experiencing a life expectancy decline that we had never before seen in this country. 3 years in a row where life expectancy was declining. And there was a couple reasons for that, one of which is the opioid crisis. And that's one of the things that I'm personally an expert in. I'm personally and emotionally invested in solving that problem. You know about my company that's focused on preventing people from getting addicted to their pain pills. But what happened before the Affordable Care Act, before Obamacare, you had three groups of people. You had the uninsured, you had the publicly insured, and you had the privately insured.
Yeah.
Now, what people usually guess is, the people who are privately insured get the best quality of care.
Yeah.
And that wasn't the case, because we're a system where if you don't have insurance, you're still guaranteed that you're going to get care, especially in an emergency situation.
Yeah.
So if that hospital has 3 patients walk in that door, they all have fractured their hip, and they all need a hip replacement immediately. And they have 3 different types of hip replacement. One's a 5-year, one's a 10-year, one's a 15-year. And there's better standards of care with each of those. Well, Medicare and Medicaid, they actually pay less per patient than it costs to treat those patients. So in order for the hospital to not lose as much money, just to cut their losses, they will give that patient the 5-year replacement. It'll break in about 5 years, and they'll have to come get another one. But Medicare cares only about lowering costs right now.
Yeah.
Not about the future. For private insurance, they care about their future costs. So what they're going to do is they're going to invest a little bit more money into the 10-year hip replacement. The last group, the hospital doesn't know whether that patient is going to pay or not, but someone is going to pay for it. And because someone is going to pay for it, what they know is they can give whatever standard of care increases that bill the most. And so usually that meant, before the Obamacare, that patient would get the best quality of care in this country. Now, their life expectancy was not as long as someone on private insurance, because private insurance also, you are most likely to be wealthier anyway. You're most likely to be taking better care of your body anyway than if you were uninsured. But those uninsured people, they got the 15-year. And maybe they also got, instead of just given a bottle of pain pills and sent on their way to deal with the pain after the surgery, like anyone on Medicare and Medicaid would be on, and that's one of the primary drivers of the opioid crisis in this country, was the expansion of Medicare and Medicaid.
Yeah.
Because at that point, look, if you're going to be doing physical therapy or anything like that, it's costing you as the hospital a ton of money that Medicare and Medicaid is not going to pay you back for. So they would just give them the bottles of pills and say, have fun, call us if you need more.
Yeah.
Versus on the uninsured side, it used to be that they would get the best quality of care. They would get physical therapy. They'd get heat treatments. They'd get all the innovative stuff because the hospital could charge more and bill more. And eventually they would get paid back that money. Now, after Obamacare, what we have is the uninsured now have to be insured.
Or else they get fined for it.
Or else they get fined. Or else the fine was $900.
What a smart system.
Oh, absolutely. for anyone listening, that was entirely facetious. It is a dumb, stupid system that removes people's personal liberties and takes the people who were uninsured, receiving the best quality of care in the world, and moving them to the worst quality of care this country provides. That, in my mind, is not only bad policy, that is immoral.
And we talk about the prescriptions of opioids. We talk about walking into the hospital and getting prescribed more just for pain. What's something not many people know is gag clauses exist. Now, what those do is just like gag orders. Many of you have seen on President Trump. They issue a gag order to prevent President Trump or whoever is facing an indictment from speaking out against or in favor or against, speaking out in general about certain things that involve the case. So gag clauses exist for pharmaceutical companies, for insurance companies, for pharmacies. We're going to discuss that here in a minute. We're going to discuss the consequences of FDR's New Deal. Stick with us. God bless. Be right back.
Here's important new information from the Diabetes Solution Center for you, a family member, or a loved one suffering with diabetes. If you have lost your provider, or if you need a provider for diabetic supplies, you may qualify to receive your diabetic testing supplies now with little or no out-of-pocket cost, regardless of your age. All you need is Medicare or private insurance to be potentially eligible. Call the Diabetes Solution Center right now for details. Just takes a couple of minutes. Our friendly, knowledgeable agents will give you free, no-obligation information, handle all the insurance paperwork, and make sure your supplies are delivered directly to your door for free.
Call U.S. Medical Supply 24 hours a day. 800-597-9323. 800-597-9323. 800-597-9323. Call right now. 800-597-9323.
Fast Track Student Loans can get your student loans out of default, stop any wage garnishments, stop collection calls, and stop seizure of your tax refund. Give yourself a break. Stop the stress and get your student loan payments down to as little as $25 a month based on what you can afford to pay. 800-709-4395. 800-709-4395. 800-709-4395. 800-709-4395. Fast Track Student Loans can get your student loans out of default, stop any wage garnishments, stop collection calls, and stop seizure of your tax refund. Give yourself a break. Stop the stress and get your student loan payments down to as little as $25 a month based on what you can afford to pay. 800-709-4395. 800-709-4395. 800-709-4395. 800-709-4395.
You're listening to Joco Community Radio.
Welcome back, Johnson County, to today's episode of Let Freedom Ring. I'm your host, Jake Wernette. Hope everybody stuck with us through that break. First, I'd like to say, before we get started again, Joco Community Radio is proud to be the voice of Johnson County, Texas, and is live 24/7 on the TuneIn Radio Network. TuneInJoco.com is the place to find all the best ways to listen and watch. The station app is also available for free on both Android and Apple devices. Simply search your store, check out the lineup and more at JocoCommunityRadio.com. This episode and more are brought to you by Next Level Claims, making your insurance work for you. Reach out to your local Texas sales rep at 844-839-4245. That's 844-839-4245. Be sure to dress your arms and more at thetiffy.com. Also like to give my bi-weekly shout out. I didn't know if I did it Tuesday. I don't think I did. To the Burleson HTO. I got the wild red raspberry tea today. It's nice to change your palate up when you have the same thing for 2 or 3 days a week. Happy hour is 2 to 4 for anybody interested. A $3.99 huge tea as big as a Sonic cup is only $1.99. So why not go in, if especially with this unusually hot autumn weather. I have been in Texas for about 7 years, so I don't know what unusually hot is for autumn this time of year. I'm still kind of getting used to summer heat, to be honest. We're back with discussing the consequences of FDR's New Deal. And I wish I had a whiteboard in here, but I'm going to be drawing some parallels between the Great Society, the New Deal, and the COVID spending that we did, the $10.5 trillion put forth when Nancy Pelosi was still Speaker of the House. And we might get into the Federal Reserve, too. I have some pretty outspoken comments about them. But we went over welfare spending. We went over Social Security spending. We look at the sources of federal revenue from 1950 to 2016. The biggest difference here is social insurance or Social Security payroll taxes only made up roughly less than 10%. So we're sitting at about 9% for 1950 is what the federal government's total income would have come from. Now we look at 2016, we are sitting at roughly the second largest margin there aside from individual income tax. And that's probably about 30% of our total revenue in the federal government comes from something to something that we have to spend that on. So that 30% doesn't go towards paying for schools. It doesn't go towards paying for defense. The individual income tax, the corporate income tax, excise taxes, tariffs, all of those things pay for the discretionary spending. The Social Security tax did not exist prior to 1933 or 1935 when FDR had initiated that program. So when we look at government spending today, government spending in 2022 was roughly $2.3 trillion. Now, when we talk about government spending, the majority of that is going to be about discretionary spending. When we look at the total mandatory spending and all of those things, it really buffs up there. We talk about all of these things, it might be $5-6 trillion that we are spending total. And that is on top of the loans, the victory money that we might give out to Ukraine, which $140 billion, a lot of money. For anybody wondering, there is a website that I like. It's called Demonocracy. Now, this is not something religious. It's not satanic or Luciferian. Demonocracy.info, demonocracy.info is a website I've used many times to show people the infographics of the bottomless pit that our federal government is spending. So there's a section called Your Tax Dollars at Work. Now, what most people don't know is $1 million is a lot of money. We talk about that on a duffel bag. You can't fit $1 million into a duffel bag like in the movies. $100 million it fits roughly onto the standard military size pallet or a semi pallet, and that would end up being about 5 to 6 feet high. $100 million weighs about a ton. And so when we spend $100 million, you're sitting here, you have to spend $100 million to spend $1 billion. So we're spending roughly $1,000 for every 10 billion, 1,000 pallets. We might be spending 10,000, 20,000, 30,000 pallets worth of $100 million bills in $1 bills on sending all this money overseas. Now, on a pallet, a standard semi pallet that weighs about 2,000 pounds, that's all $100 bills, mind you, that we are sending abroad, that we're sending to these countries that we should not be paying to hate us. They should be able to hate us for free, in the words of Senator John Neely Kennedy. So when we sit here and talk about all this money that's being sent overseas, I want to stress that this all originated from the FDR administration. The Lend-Lease Act sent all of our tanks, all of our B-29 design models overseas to the Soviet Union, to the British, to the French, so that they could have Sherman tanks, Patton tanks. And we saw all of these things start up in the 40s and the 30s with all of this government entitlement spending. So when we talk about the federal debt, why it is the way it is today, why did Trump add $10.5 trillion, $6 trillion, whatever it was, to the federal budget and to the federal deficit? It's because the mindset that we have had since the 1930s is that it's okay to spend more money. Now, I am as anti-New Deal as it comes. I can understand the mindset behind it, but I don't believe that it's the government's job to pay me to not grow a certain amount of crops. I don't think it's the federal government's job to pay me to grow a certain amount of corn. I don't think it's the government's job. As a gentleman in our prayer group that we meet every Thursday morning, I haven't attended in a few weeks, so I want to apologize to them if they're listening for that. School's been pretty rough lately. But when we discuss FDR, I gave a presentation over how most of his administration was socialist and communist leaning. And if you really look at the Communist Party that had 200,000 voters across the country in the 1930s, their Communist Party, the American Communist Party, actually withdrew their candidate for the 1930s. They won a governorship in the Midwest, I believe, one time, and that was really the only socialist communist that has ever held an office in the United States. But when we look at who their candidate was that they endorsed for president, it was Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Now, for those who don't know, and I will present this later in another episode, the United States actually got the idea for Social Security from the 5-year plans that the Soviet Union put out. Now, for those who don't remember, the Soviet Union has had about 10 5-year plans. So the entire century almost that they were a country, they never ran out of 5-year plans. It was really they didn't have the gumption to stick around unless they had another 5-year plan, which is a very dangerous thing for a country, especially one as volatile as the Soviet Union, where you don't know who's going to be dictator, who's going to oust who's going to get murdered next, who's going to get sent to a Siberian labor camp. It was also the Nazis that had instituted a program much like Social Security called old age insurance. Now, you can look back at the Nazi Party's manifesto, their manual, written by some guy with the most stereotypical German name you can find, Hans something, I think. I don't know. The Nazis created old age insurance, which was essentially created and revamped many times before 1935 when Hitler took power. The party was designing these things up. And so the United States got our ideas from all of these other tyrannical dictatorships abroad and instituted that as a Social Security Administration, as the Welfare Administration, the Works Progress Administration. The Nazis and the Soviets dreamt of all this stuff because we talk about social safety nets. One thing that many people say is the Nazis and the communists were not on the same team. The Nazis hated the communists. The communists hated the Nazis. Well, what many young people today don't realize is before Operation Barbarossa in 41, the Soviets and the fascists in Germany actually got along pretty good. And they dreamt together of having complete control over the entire earth. That was then. Before that, what not many people understand is that Adolf Hitler and Mao Zedong and Trotsky, Engels, all of these people had very similar mentors and mentees when it came to their ideology. What not many people know is NASDAP was the official acronym for the Nazi Party. The National Arbeites Deutsches Labor's Party, essentially, the S in that stood for Soziales, or socialist, the National Socialist German Workers' Party. Now, I don't know about you, but it's pretty funny that Karl Marx and all these guys came out and said, socialism is the apparatus through which our revolution gauges forth. Our locomotive of communism will arrive through the process of socialism, which we look at Gorbachev and we look at Nikita Khrushchev back in the Cold War. These guys said the same thing. We will keep feeding socialist ideology to your citizens until you wake up one day and you realize you are a communist country. Small increments of socialism, just like prescribing a pill to an elderly man at the hospital. That is how socialism gets into the body of the American dream. And essentially, we didn't see anything short of that under FDR's administration. Now, I know that our elders have high respects for FDR because he led during World War II, and he was championed as this image of a savior, almost a Christ-like figure in the White House, who through his his gospel of fireside chats instituted a new age of prosperity for the American people. But what we really saw was we never recovered from the Great Depression until after Eisenhower got out. And Eisenhower is the gentleman that I credit for getting us out of the Great Depression, because if you really look at what happened, big business had no priority to small business. Eisenhower had the lowest budget up until that point. He had cut federal spending to the lowest point it had ever been in that last roughly half century. Eisenhower had created systems to keep up small businesses, systems to build more schools instead of spending on defense spending. He'd actually cut, I believe, in today's money, about $90 billion out of the defense industry, and had given that money to the schools, the Arms for Peace programs that he started, which essentially took the money and discretionary spending, transferred it over by a new balanced budget over to Department of Education and other states programs that invested more of that into the schools, into public health. Eisenhower really did something that FDR could never do, and that was balance a budget and create balanced spending by taking it from one place that it was not needed. He got us out of Korea within 3 or 4 months of his presidency, something that he promised to do. And many might remember the commercials. We don't even have enough tanks for the fighting in Korea. Eisenhower walks across the DMZ. 3 months later, it's solved. And FDR is sitting here for 10 years in office, 12 years, 13 years, spending what today we equate as hundreds of billions of dollars. Eisenhower's administration didn't even spend $100 billion a year, almost. In long-term spending, with long-term inflation, we had such a balanced budget in the 50s. That is what really got us on track to recovering finally, 20 years after the Great Depression had started in 1929, roughly almost 10, 15 years after that. What we saw was America was back on track because we had invested in small businesses. We had invested in the prosperity of the American country. We had created the National Highway and Defense Act that allowed President Eisenhower to take up more money for the Federal Highway Administration to create roads, to create all these infrastructure projects. That allowed American commerce to grow, interstate commerce. We talk about the Commerce Clause with Congress. It's really what vamped up the United States, was all these programs that bettered the United States. Now we look at the Civilian Conservation Corps, the Works Progress Administration. These guys were building hydroelectric dams that provided hundreds of megawatts of power for a town that might have been 50 miles away in the Tennessee Valley, or the Hoover Dam. Those were some good things that came out. But what we're seeing here is we're not talking about putting Americans back to work and gaining valuable skills for their trades. We're talking about all these programs that just increased federal power. I'm just going to run down the list real quick. We've got 11 minutes left, roughly 12. The Agricultural Adjustment Agency. Now, this is a program who was led by none other than a gentleman who was caught for being a Communist Party member. And I can even look up his name, because I know some people might appreciate the factuality of it. I'm going to look it up here. I wrote a whole presentation on this for a men's group, and it was really something interesting. It was called How FDR Ushered in Socialism. Now, I'm just going to go through this presentation real quick because I feel like, too, it's important. So, Khrushchev said, "We do not have to invade the United States. We will destroy you from within." FDR was the longest-serving president in American history. FDR is called the savior of the American economy by Thomas Friedman and Michael Mandelbaum, put into a book. These public investments gave a huge boost to the American economy during the Great Depression. FDR stabilized the country's finances, and these measures may well have saved capitalism in the United States. Executive Order 6102, my favorite thing to point at people. Repealed, took away, abolished the private individual's right to hold gold investments and forced those with gold to register their savings with the federal government. You can no longer have your own gold savings at home under the FDR administration. That was not reversed until Gerald Ford got into office in the 70s after the Nixon scandal. So FDR had used executive power to threaten the Supreme Court. Essentially what he did was he said, "I will pack the court with one person for every justice over the age of 70. At that time, it was everybody. So for everybody who didn't agree with the New Deal, who didn't agree to uphold it, one of those, the justice's name was Roberts, not John Roberts. The two are not related. Justice Roberts changed his mind all of a sudden within 2 years after political pressure had forced him to say, well, I don't really want to have FDR pack the court, so I might as well go along with it. FDR also placed a Price Controls Act via the Emergency Price Control Act of 1942. So to get us out of the Great Depression, we had to employ the tactics of our enemies in that day, which seemed pretty funny. And here's the real funny part. The Social Security Administration, FDR's labor secretary, Francis Perkins. I have 2 books at home, The Red Record and The Red Network. Both of those were written by Elizabeth Dilling, a very rare book that you can't find anymore for under $75. I paid $150 for both, but to me, history is worth $150. Somebody might not know that in 10 years. They might get rid of the book. Somebody's got to keep it up. So Frances Perkins, per the proof, the only thing I could find was a Communist Party article on her published 2 years ago. That was the latest information you could find. Elizabeth Dilling wrote this 80 years earlier in the 1930s. Frances Perkins was a member of the American Socialist Party between 1907 and 1909. That was also backed up by an article from the Democrat Socialists of America Party. Now, the Works Progress Administration, CCC, NIRA, the National Industrial Recovery Act, and AAA were all programs that subsidized family farms and ordered surplus goods destroyed, despite what would have reset the dollar. So when we talk about recessions, as bad as the word is, I have a professor at college. I'm not going to divulge his name out of the interest for his job. He has a wonderful family, I'm sure. He has a wonderful husband, I'm sure. Has a really good job. He teaches for a hobby. Now, many people have this idea of a recession being a bad thing. We have to create bailouts. We have to bail out the banks. We have to uphold these big corporations. But that's never been the American dream. Never in the United States has our founding fathers said we need to uphold the corporations of King George above the heads of the American farmers and the yeoman workers, the metalsmiths, the blacksmiths, the people that are putting the shoe cobblers, the people that build the cobblestone roads in these colonies were always put at the top of the list compared to these corporations. And many of these corporations were backed by central banks. So we look at the Virginia Company. We look at all of these companies, the Jamestown Company, all of these people that came over and then paid for the investment of these colonies were central banks of Europe. Shoot, even we look at the gentleman Columbus, his whole program, his whole explorative to the New World was paid for by pawning the crown jewelry from Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand, pawning the crown jewelry to a central bank and using that money to loan to Columbus. So we talk about all of these big things. There has never been an interest in the American people when we promote these corporations over the common worker. And that's not a communist ideology. That's just simple math. That's simple science. That's simple social studies. When we look at the American people, what have the American people gained from the New Deal besides debt beyond our wildest dreams, besides deficit spending, the normalcy of creating these programs that gut the American pocketbook, create higher taxes, force our kids onto a death chain that we are never going to pay off? We have all of these social programs, but where is the betterment of our American people? I promise you, you cannot find one thing that bettering the American people through Social Security. My grandma doesn't make anything off Social Security. Where's her money? My friends, I've had several friends. Met several older folks on welfare programs. Where is their betterment? They are still paying off things. FDR promised a new generation of wealth and prosperity for the American people through social upbringing programs. There is nothing in the entire world that has ever been gained from these social betterment programs. We look at the Great Society program. Most of these places that were targeted were welfare programs and social security programs for Black Americans, Hispanics, and all of these people were only criminals and put on welfare because of heinous congressmen and heinous presidents that sent all of these jobs overseas. You really want to better Black communities. You really want to better the average American citizen. It's not even about race. Bring the jobs back. Stop paying child labor. Stop paying slave labor over in China. Bring the jobs back. Give these people a federal betterment program that trains them on their skills that they can take it from the federal government after a 2-year program and sets them up for success in a trade skill program. Now, I apologize for yelling, but this is something that I am very passionate about. Our federal government does not care about the American people. FDR did not care about the American people. What he cared about was being the man that saved the United States. He was as establishment as it came. He took away the private ownership of wealth. He took away the gold. He took away private ownership of assets. He put it all in the hands of a central bank. Who even Woodrow Wilson said, I am a most unlucky man. I have unwittingly turned my country over to a small group of creditors. I have taken away their financial independence and put it into the hands of a few men who would clip the wings off of an eagle. FDR said that too. There is a small group of men in Washington who would clip the wings of an eagle for their own gain. That is all quotes. That is all what's been said. You look at the AAA. It was a massive, massive effort to infiltrate the United States through our social betterment programs. The AAA, Alger Hiss, who had been convicted of being a communist, was a federal lawyer who defended the AAA. He was a State Department official and a member of the Communist Party. We look at the Communist Party membership. It was roughly 30,000 in 1938, and after the party aligned with Franklin Roosevelt, they had 52,000 members added. And that was roughly 3 years later. 50,000 people in 3 years signed up to become part of the Communist Party because they backed Roosevelt. We look at FDR's agricultural secretary, Henry Wallace, was labeled a friend of the Overseas Communist Party by none other than J. Edgar Hoover, and even had attended and given a 1946 Madison Garden speech written by Soviet agent Harry Magdoff. These were the people that were working and creating Roosevelt's social betterment programs. They were communists. Hal Ware was employed by the AAA. The Agricultural Adjustment Agency was accused of being a Soviet agent who had formed a group of federal officials in an infiltration ring within primarily the State Department, the Agricultural Department, and the War Department. These guys had all of our national secrets. They knew where the farms were. They knew where the money was going. They knew what the State Department was planning for the communists. They knew where our defense spending was. They knew where our Manhattan Project was. These guys were all coming in through these social betterment programs. What better way to create socialism in this country than a mass effort to make it look like the government was the savior of the people? You know who else did that? Nazi Germany and the Soviet Socialist Republics, the Soviet Union. Those people came in and looked like big, great billionaire heroes. These people created programs that made them look like they were raising up the common man. Was that not the goal, or at least the indoctrinating idea of men like Friedrich Engels, Karl Marx, Trotsky, Joseph Stalin? All of those men, Mao Zedong, Pol Pot, Castro, all of them were championed as heroes of their people because they were bringing up the common man. But I don't see Cuba in any better place after all their social betterment programs. Even one of the big guys, I don't remember if it's Saddam Hussein or Osama bin Laden. One of them actually came out on the news and said, "Yeah, our plan's to wait for the United States to go bankrupt and then attack them. That's where we'll make our last stand." So you have all of these programs that indebt the future. How are we going to pay for Social Security when our pyramid of our population is collapsing at the bottom? It's starting to look like this, a V. What that means is there's no young people to pay that Social Security. 50 years from now, when we're below replacement rate and Joe Biden keeps bringing in these illegal migrants to take our jobs, to put all of our people, I don't care if you're Democrat or you're Republican, you are not going to be living and working. It's going to be slave labor for the rich, and it's going to be universal basic income for the average Americans that rely on these jobs, rely on these skills, and who are they going to be relying on when they get laid off? The federal government. A communist country is the only thing that's going to come from these FDR programs. And I promise you, just watch it. Just watch it. If we don't fight back and elect leaders who will stand up for a balanced budget, who will institute a gold standard or a standard based on something and get rid of these agencies and shrink the government, we are going to collapse as a country. God bless you. I'll see you next Tuesday. And may Christ bless the Republic of the United States.
From Burleson to Venus and Grandview to Godly, this is the voice of Johnson County. Joco Community